Welcome back into the Vandy 24/7 podcast on the Believe Network. I'm your host, Billy Dirk, alongside Robbie Weinstein. I am live in Atlanta. Robbie back home in Nashville. Vanderbilt just wrapped up their day at SEC Media Days yesterday. Clark Lee, Diego Pavia, as well as Brandon Fontenette. You had Martel Hight as well. So busy day yesterday for Vanderbilt. Obviously, busy day for Diego Pavia. We're going to get into some of the quotes and obviously some of Clark Lee's quotes as well, and what some of them may mean. And I know Robbie has a couple of pieces out, so we'll touch on some of that. But wanted to touch base with you guys after SEC Media Days and today our football coverage brought to you by Bulovas Wealth Management of Raymond James. Joe enjoys providing superior service by putting his clients first. Of course, former Vanderbilt kicker still involved with the program, goes to all the home games, and still in Nashville. Raymond James is comprehensive financial planning gives their clients a truly integrated and tailored approach to wealth management. At the end of the day, they just enjoy working hard for great people. Log on to their website at raymondjames.com/Bulovas Wealth Management for more info. Robbie, what'd you take away from Vandy's day at SEC Media Days? Obviously, Diego Pavia was the talk of the day, and probably will have people talking throughout the rest of the week. But what was your take on what you heard yesterday?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of these media availabilities, especially the ones that get circulated, like when Clark Lee is up at the podium, or sometimes even when the players are up at the podium, there's a separate, like, players have a formal session, and then they also have a period where they sit there basically, and reporters can come by and talk to them. The more scripted stuff is almost useless a lot of times, honestly. Like Clark Lee, his opening statement he pre-wrote, and it was half the length of his entire media availability, it felt like. But I do think it's interesting to see, people should take Vandy seriously given the, what they did last year and having a star quarterback returning and all of that. But it's still kind of interesting and jarring to see it, in real life unfolding. Everybody seems to be taking Vandy seriously. I mean, it sounded like Pavia had a huge throng of reporters surrounding him, like the biggest amount of anyone so far this week. And it's just a little bit of a different experience to see, like, hey, Vandy football is actually relevant right now and is getting legitimate attention. Whereas normally, that's kind of the period when they show up there where everybody takes their lunch break or whatever.
Yeah, and look, Vanderbilt, like you said, it's not typically a hot, fiery time for Vanderbilt football program. SEC Media Days. They typically, I feel like we're used to seeing them go Wednesday, and maybe even Thursday. Some years. I mean, I don't even that might not even be the case, but I think there's a reason they put Diego Pavia and Vanderbilt on Monday, and it was the last session of the day. That there's some strategy involved there, and look, we know what Diego Pavia is about. We know what Clark Lee's about. But like you said, Robbie, for them to even be talking this way, that's new for Vanderbilt. I think Diego has given Clark a sense of confidence as well. He has given the program a sense of confidence. And I think the next step is continuing to elevate and prove that you're not just a 6-6, 7-5 program, that you can take that next step to a 7-5 program, 8-4, maybe even who knows 9-3, and on the bubble of a playoff berth one season. But it's not media days that changes that, right? It's on field performance. But there is something to be said about Vanderbilt in the limelight, right? We saw the teaser of the Netflix special, and Vanderbilt is heavily involved there with the win over Alabama. Times are changing, Robbie, but it's also this is a put up or shut up year, as we've talked about. Not put up or shut up. That's a bad term, but it is a prove it year for Vanderbilt, especially after everything that we've heard them say.
Yeah, I mean, Clark, I believe, mentioned up on the podium that their goal is to play into January and that he, thinks they're capable of doing that. You never hear that from Vanderbilt. I think sometimes they've expressed confidence in the past, but maybe not that specific and clearly aiming either for the college football playoff, or if not, then a high level bowl game that would feature kind of top 25 teams, maybe SEC versus Big Ten. I think they have, usually it takes longer to build a program than just one 6-6 season and then 7-6 with the bowl win to all of a sudden vaulting to 8-4 or 9-3 or something along those lines. But I also think so much in college football comes down to quarterback play, really in football in general. And, it's tough to count them out when not only, as we've talked about, Pavia is a very good player, but I mean, you see again and again at events like these, just kind of the magnetism that guy has. And so, the difference in feeling in the program from, 2 or 3 years ago or whatever is just massive. I mean, this guy, you can, every time you hear him talk, you're like, I would play for that dude, like he would be a fun person to
Yeah.
have on my team. And so I think there's no doubt like the level of swagger that they've got is just completely different from anything that I've ever seen from a Vanderbilt team. Like you said, that doesn't guarantee a certain number of wins, but I do think it has helped.
Another piece that came out was Martel Hight. We had known this. We've mentioned this on the board, and finally it came to the limelight of a Pete Thamel tweet, and that was another piece of sort of national news, and had some people talking. And could this guy, be a Travis Hunter type of player and play receiver, play DB, play special teams, return punts? Robbie and Clark said that, yeah, you could. I think in every game you'll see him play offense, defense, special teams. That's something new at Vanderbilt as well. Now, can he be as good as Travis Hunter? Probably not. But can he impact winning, as Clark Lee likes to say? Yes, he can. And it's going to be really interesting to see Martel Hight on offense in particular, Robbie. We'll be watching for that in fall camp.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't realize until you said that Pete Thamel tweeted about it. But yeah, I mean, he is going to play all three phases in every single game, just like Clark said. I mean, I think we've known that for a little bit. The interesting thing from that angle is that I had started hearing stuff, about him potentially being 50-50 offense, defense, or maybe even more offense than defense. And I was a little bit like, is that real? Is that that would be a big change. It could. I don't know if it would hurt his draft stock necessarily, but he probably would be a corner in the NFL, and so from his standpoint, is he totally going to want to do that? And I was like, oh, I want to see what happens in fall camp, also with the transfer wide receivers before I completely buy into that. But when the head coach comes out and says something like that on the record, I think that it kind of soft confirms what I had been hearing about that. Honestly, he may end up being more of a wide receiver than a corner this year, and I kind of get it. I would say they don't really, when you think about like Trent Hudson and Junior Sherrill, especially Hudson is not a guy who is going to do a ton with the ball in his hands. Sherrill definitely can. I mean, he's a kick returner, right? But they could use a little bit more dynamic ability at wide receiver. And if you watched Martel Hight return punts last year, you can see that he has that. I think the big thing is they haven't had corners like this in a long time. They're, the first 2 or 3 years under Clark Lee, the cornerback play was brutal. And so they made a position coach change, excuse me. And I think that has helped a little bit with Jamal Richardson, Clark taking over as DC. I know he's handed that off, but that has helped as well. I think stabilize things a little bit. And then they've done some stuff in the transfer portal where Mark Davis Jr. and Marlon Jones Jr., they weren't expecting to have those guys on this year's team. And then when they had to miss last season due to the Marlon Jones had cancer and Davis had a torn Achilles, all of a sudden that totally juiced the cornerback room for this year in a way that nobody really ever intended. And so now the result is that, yeah, Martel Hight might be your best corner, but you've got 4 other guys who are only 10% worse than him or something like that. And you don't need everyone.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The corner room all of a sudden with Jones and Davis got bolstered, and so not that Martel Hight won't play corner, but you can afford to maybe subtract his snaps at corner by 10 to 15 potentially. Now, if you start seeing some injuries in that room, you've got Martel Hight maybe subtract from the offense. But I was wondering how it developed. How did this start? And I think there's maybe we question Clark a little bit more, but he said it was the offensive guys coming to me, and he said Alex Bailey started it slow because Clark's a defensive guy and obviously wants Martel Hight on the defensive side. But I was interested in how it started, the genesis of it. It's going to be interesting. That's going to be one of the big storylines in fall camp. Watching how crisp is Martel? How are his hands? Is he making contested catches? He had that catch, the interception. Forget who the receiver was for Tennessee, Robbie, but went up and made a catch. And I think maybe that was a play that initially caught the staff's eye. But he was an athlete in high school, and not to mention this could really help Martel Hight's draft stock as well. I mean, if he has a year we may not expect a receiver with 3 or 4 touchdowns on some big plays, and maybe an interception or two. That's a guy that all of a sudden is on a deeper, list of NFL teams. You would think.
Yeah, well, he does also. I envision a lot of it being throwing the ball on screen passes, perhaps, but I do think he can do more than that. There was at least a couple of plays in the spring where he beat someone deep, and I think once maybe there was an overthrow, and once I think he caught it for a long gain in one of the scrimmages. I don't know what his 40 time is. I'm sure it's good, but he is just kind of slippery. He's slippery. He's quick. He's athletic. I think he's going to be difficult to get, for corners to get their hands on at the line of scrimmage. And I would say, Vandy in the past, they've had solid wide receivers. Like, it's not like they're dropping a ton of passes or anything like that or making big mistakes in their blocking, but there hasn't been much explosion. And I think even though I don't know that he runs a 4.3, maybe he does, I'm not sure, he's going to add a different element for sure in terms of I think he can beat guys one-on-one in press coverage off the line of scrimmage. I think even though he's not like 200 pounds necessarily, he's going to be really difficult for corners to get their hands on and disrupt at the beginning of the play.
Last thing I want to hit on is some of Clark Lea's comments in the last really 4 to 5 minutes of that press conference. And, he was asked about how he's evolved from his first year as head coach in 2021. And as you have here in your article, he says, how much time we got? Hour and a half here? Obviously, he's been through a lot. He's learned a ton about being a coach in this league. He mentioned being down 35-0 at the end of the first quarter to a Georgia team and proceeding to lose 62-0. But he said, it all fits together, right? So, it's almost like that's how it was meant to be. Obviously, Robbie, he didn't picture losing to ETSU the way they did in his first ever game at Vanderbilt. But look at what they did last year. So my question to you, Robbie, how have you seen him grow? Because that's a common question with coaches. How have you evolved as a head coach? How have you seen Clark grow? Because you've been covering him ever since he got here.
Yeah, I have a little bit of I think I have a different answer to this than he had. And maybe, you get up on the podium and maybe he was speaking of the same things, but trying to be concise or just speaking broadly. The things that stand out to me are like hiring and firing decisions as well as personnel decisions. They have, gotten with the rest of the SEC in terms of understanding that you need to turn over your roster more than what teams used to do in college football these days every offseason. And sometimes that involves, unfortunately, telling guys like, look, we don't have a spot for you anymore. And that, that isn't something that Vandy used to do as much in the past. I think also, to me, like I mentioned, hiring and firing decisions, there were some pretty poor coaching staff decisions at key spots over the course of his first 2 or 3 seasons. Obviously, it started right away, right? Like David Rye, I don't know, we never saw him get to call plays in a game, but apparently it was so bad that he didn't even last until like a week into fall camp, still calling the plays. And then you elevate Joey Lynch, who at Ball State was totally average at best as an OC, and maybe he was overqualified to be a quarterback's coach in SEC, but OC he was underqualified for, and then he has that job for a couple of years. They don't do any of the things offensively that Clark had talked about in his opening press conference in terms of unusual formations and motion and being weird and different. And then, Nick Howell, I think Jesse Minter was a good hire, and Nick Howell was basically Clark's friend's protege. Like he hired the guy in part because he's really close with Bronco Mendenhall, and that Nick Howell came with that recommendation. Sometimes you got to tell your friends no, and that's difficult. And I think that, the defense completely crumbled, and it's hard to not point to the defensive coordinator hire when they kind of got a lot better last season when Clark took over. So I think that is an area where he's made a lot, because Tim Beck, for instance, there was no connection between Clark Lee and Tim Beck. He saw, like, he watched the game against Auburn, and he started studying in New Mexico State and saw this is exactly what Vandy needs, and I'm going to go out and talk to this guy even if I don't know him, and if that's the best hire, then that's the best hire. So I think from that standpoint, branching off a little bit and doing what's best for the program, even if it's not entirely, even if it's a little bit more difficult, I think he's gotten better at making like cutthroat decisions, and that's what you got to do in the SEC. Otherwise, you're gonna lose and you're gonna get fired.
Couldn't agree more. And look, the fundraising aspect as well. I don't think Clark. He even said this yesterday. He's like, I'm not a salesman, right? But you've got to have people around you. Barton Simmons, you would say, probably a little bit more of a salesman, and Earl Bennett too, like who isn't specifically in the football staff, but is working with athletics and just growing as a CEO, and being able to let go and bring in a Jerry Kill, and give the reins off. Right.
That's
I don't think Clark would have done
like,
that.
a lot of coaches wouldn't want to do that. Yeah, Jerry Stackhouse didn't want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think there's a lot of areas he's grown. I think, like Clark said, he could have talked for 2 hours there, but entering his 5th year, and that is a little crazy. But we'll continue to talk more football. Obviously, Vanderbilt's day is done. Kind of nice. They're in and out. They bust down and then bust right back. So not a bad 3 hours for Vanderbilt. But Robbie, thanks for taking the time. I know you were short on it, but thanks for squeezing it in.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and stick with us for fall camp coverage, which is coming really soon. Actually, I think within the next couple of weeks, they're getting started.
Almost here. That's Robbie Weinstein from right here, Vandy247.com. To close it out, got a few notes for you guys. Obviously, Joe Bulovas, big thanks to him for all of his football coverage this season. Log on to raymondjames.com/Bulovas Wealth Management for more information. Also, don't forget to subscribe, Vandy247.com. Give the podcast review and a 5-star rating. That helps us get noticed. Also, thanks for all of our sponsors right now. But if you're interested in sponsoring the show, email Chris Lee at chrislee70@gmail.com. We'll have another podcast tomorrow with Chris and Luke, so stay tuned for that. But wanted to hop on from Atlanta with a report on Vanderbilt's day yesterday. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again soon with more episodes of the Vandy 24/7 podcast.